Oh God, I didn't mute the microphone for that. Yum. I thought I muted the microphone. Oops. Final Fantasy 16 came out, and a lot of fans have been enjoying it, and a lot of new fans have been getting into it. But at the end of the day, there are some veteran fans that do feel like it's not a Final Fantasy, which is an interesting conversation to have, because that sort of leads to there being a discussion about how various people view Final Fantasy and what that necessarily is. You guys already know my take on it. I think Final Fantasy has nothing to do with the turn-based system. A lot of people look at Final Fantasy and they're like, oh, that should be a turn-based thing. Not necessarily true, and that's something that the series has been trying to get away from since Final Fantasy X. If you look at the MMO background within Final Fantasy XI, and then the Gambit system with Final Fantasy XII, and 13 with its hybrid system, and then 14, yeah, you could just see Square Enix has been trying to do different things with Final Fantasy, because the core elements have always been, to me, the story, the journey, the music, the characters, and RPG elements being included in the game. But a lot of people have been saying Final Fantasy 16 is unfortunately not a Final Fantasy game, which I don't agree with. But Jesse Cox has created a video talking about it, and some people have brought it up to my attention, and I've kind of wanted to check it out, and I think it'd be really cool for us to check it out together. So this is Did Final Fantasy 16 Leave Old Fans Behind? From Jesse Cox.
And today I want to do something a little bit different, because I noticed that in the run-up to and release of Final Fantasy 16, there was a small but growing group of people online who began to say that they had problems with this newest release in the famous RPG franchise. This time produced by Creative Business Unit 3, the team behind the extremely popular Final Fantasy XIV MMORPG. And at the time, I felt like I understood 16 is a different direction for Final Fantasy, and one that some people will either like or not like, and that's totally fine. But over the months leading to release, and with the drop of the demo, and now at launch, that not for me has kind of morphed into a not my Final Fantasy. A sort of catch-all phrase that I think harkens back to what is really a non-existent era where we all knew what Final Fantasy was, and 16? Well, it ain't it. Which is nonsense. There's never been a this is what Final Fantasy is. Every single Final Fantasy game has pushed the boundaries of what the franchise was before, and every single one is different, even if those differences are only in storytelling or world building. So when, for example, I watched SkillUp's review of the game, which, by the way, a good review, dude makes great content, it bugged the hell out of me that the video opened with, in Square Enix's haste to evolve this franchise into something new, they've left behind far too much that made Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. In trying to reach a new audience, they've left behind the audience that got the franchise.
I have not seen the SkillUp review. I've been seeing people talk about it on Twitter and mention it, and I was even tagged in it, but I haven't actually watched anybody's review on the game. I've been sick as hell trying to recover from that, but also focus on trying to make my own content on top of that. So I'm assuming he's going to be elaborating on it more. He already started to right there. This conversation is very interesting to me.
Franchise to this point. And while most reviews and most players are extremely happy with the game, that's the thing I noticed in most of the negative talk about it, that there's this undercurrent of they've chosen to leave what made Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. They're leaving old fans behind for the new. And look, getting new fans was 100% the goal of Creative Business Unit 3. Yoshida, the producer of this and 14, said as much. And
that's true, they said that a lot.
The franchise's history and impact, many players have created their own idea of what Final Fantasy is to them, turning a blind eye to what the series is as a whole. It reminds me of when I was asked to be on a special board for PAX with various other people in the gaming space, and the question they asked us to help them solve was, how can we grow PAX? Because at the moment, our core audience and attendees are getting older, having kids, have less time to come to the show, so how do we grow? And so myself and all the others in the room sat around thinking up all sorts of ways they could do this, offering advice, but the pushback we kept getting was, if we take your advice, we could risk alienating those who already attend. And so the conversation would devolve into, what is the point of having us here if you're afraid to take the big risks?
That's actually true. You do need to take risks in order to grow, right? Like, for example, with my personal experience, last year, June and July time, when Final Fantasy VII Rebirth actually had like an event where they showcased the trailer and we got a bunch of like stuff going on, I was at 56,000 subs. I was. Like, my channel has grown, right? In the first year, we went from 6,000 to 20,000, then from 20,000 in 2021 to 40,000. But throughout 2022, we sort of lingered and hovered around the 40 to like 50,000 range. It was really hard to like break past that. It is what it is, right? Like, our channel has regular viewership. Not everybody's gonna sub. I know that's the case, right? But what I'm trying to bring up and compare this to is, once I started to cover a different element of games that I wasn't covering before, which in this case was multiverses, the channel boomed. Like, it was ridiculous. In a span of 2 months, I went from 56,000 subscribers to 100,000 in 2 months. In my 3 years of doing that with Final Fantasy, I had not hit that type of boom at all, like whatsoever. So multiverses and other content that I was making at the time was helping me grow. So I took a risk in covering a totally different game from what I normally do outside of Final Fantasy, and it ended up working out for me very well. I ended up doing extremely well with content, growth, and all that good stuff. And then after that, we transitioned into doing Resident Evil, because Final Fantasy was just not having a whole lot of stuff going on. So with Resident Evil and Resident Evil 4 Remake coming out and all that content, I was able to create stuff around that, and we were able to grow even more past that. Now we're over 120,000 subscribers. So I totally see where they're essentially saying that, yeah, you should be taking risk. And I agree with that as a content creator too. And if you have any type of like business that you're trying to grow, it's important to calculate the risks if they are necessary enough to take them or like make them. Like, if you're just sitting around just making the same thing over and over again and expecting to grow, you will grow at a very slower rate, but you'll grow even more if you expand outside of your reach. And you never know. Some people will hit it off really big with other elements outside of that. You don't have to literally restrict yourself to one box. And that's what the series Final Fantasy, or I guess Square Enix, is trying to do, and appeal to other action game players and like fans of God of War and all these other popular like AAA games that aren't catering to turn-based fans only. In order to succeed in your business, you got to take risks.
The only way you grow is by doing this. On this very channel, one which I have had probably far too long, I spent 10 years doing Let's Plays. And then the ecosystem changed, and Twitch is where you went to go watch Let's Plays, and YouTube Let's Plays kind of died off unless you had some sort of gimmick or some sort of fun goof thing that you were doing. For the most part, most people didn't want to watch complete Let's Plays on YouTube, especially from someone who...
My first 4 years on YouTube was like that. I was trying to do Let's Plays to like nobody. I was making Let's Play videos and expecting that people were going to be coming here to watch me play this game, but that made no sense because I haven't developed a community at all. Nobody knows who the fuck I am. Why would they care about what my experience is? I even have that element happening right now when there's other bigger channels that people care about more. Like, let's be real. Everybody flocks to go watch creators like Max or like Asmongold like play games because they care about what their experience is. They want to know what they think about it. And I do the same thing too. I watch those guys. I love watching their content. It's not to say that they're more interesting than me or I think I'm more interesting in any way. It's not like that. It's just that they're more established creators in that element and I'm not established in that element. So why try to focus on that when it's just not there, right?
In gaming space or influencer or content creator terms is an old man. And so I stopped for the most part and instead did more news related things and videos like this. And yeah,
holy fucking shit, me too. And I've been telling people this for months now. If you want to grow on YouTube, and I'm sorry if I keep pausing, but like, this is such big facts right here. If you want to grow on YouTube in general or create a bigger audience, you need to do something informative. Some people will boom off of Let's Plays and like funny gameplay montages and stuff like that. But if you want to grow right now and grow quicker and establish an audience, updates. Because I was starting off with the guides and the battle content stuff for Final Fantasy VII Remake and fighting games, and those did really well for me. But obviously, after we did everything that the game had to offer, what else is there really to talk about or make? There's nothing. So I started to cover the updates on what's coming soon for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2, what we can expect, what we would like to see, what would you like to see? And that's how I continue to grow. And now we're in this element, and we continue to do that.
Sure, I took a hit at the start. People who had been here for a while were like, this isn't the Jesse I know, not my Jesse. But the channel recovered, it's growing again, and I've never been happier. And that is what's happening to Final Fantasy. In order to keep the franchise around another 30 years, they have to grow and change and become something that more reflects what today's gamers want. And going back to SkillUp's review, just look at the comments. People in the comments are saying, never played a Final Fantasy, but I'm gonna try this one out. And
I've seen a lot of that too.
Huge victory for Yoshida and Square Enix and everyone involved, no matter what the lineage of Final Fantasy is. And we should talk that lineage, because Final Fantasy is a series that has always been about taking risks. The name Final Fantasy comes partially from the fact that it was Sakaguchi's last attempt, his final risk at creating something before giving up on game dev altogether.
This man rocking the Balenciaga black tee.
Each iteration since has taken the same risks. The rest is history. A history worth talking about, because I'm still asking the question, when was Final Fantasy Final Fantasy? And more importantly, how do you even define what that means? Clearly, we're gonna include music. The music has always been amazing in Final Fantasy. The visuals, even back in the Sprite and Mode 7 days, were stunning. Then maybe when you say it's not Final Fantasy, you mean the combat system. How it's not turn-based, or it looks different. You miss the active time battles, which really haven't been a thing since 2001 in Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy 11 and 14 are MMORPGs and have MMORPG-style combat.
Well, actually, technically, Final Fantasy X was turn-based. It wasn't ATB-based, right? Because like you see right here, this actually shows you whose turn is coming up next. So this was like a visual bar to showcase to you that it is, in fact, turn-based. Not a nitpick by any means whatsoever, but I don't think Final Fantasy X was ATB-based.
Final Fantasy 11 and 14 are MMORPGs and have MMORPG-style combat. 12 did away with random encounters and made enemies visible on the map. The active time battle system became the active dimension battle system, and
Final Fantasy 12 was Legion's favorite Final Fantasy game, by the way.
Introduced gambits. 13 returned to a variant of the ATB system, although with much more button mashing. 15 introduced an action-based system called the Active Cross Battle, which instead of a menu, players mapped buttons on a controller. They're all over the place. And the active time battle system of old wasn't really introduced until Final Fantasy 4 and 5, and then 5 had the job system, which was a whole other thing, and then that wasn't in Final Fantasy 6. So I guess then maybe when you're saying it's not your Final Fantasy, you're talking about the setting or the world building. But even there, the games have always pushed the boundaries. Final Fantasy 1 through 5 were fantasy stories set in worlds of castles and crystals, and sure, there were airships and chocobos and moogles, but all of that took time to develop too. There were no chocobos in Final Fantasy 1. The first moogle was in Final Fantasy 3. Final Fantasy 4 was the first time they really started to delve into deep character drama. Final Fantasy 6 was this push into the trope of magic versus technology. 7 then took that concept and ran with it, as technology and its impact on the world played a major role in that storytelling. Hell, you spent the first part of that game in a giant city, dystopian cyberpunk setting, which was shocking at the time. 8 is about teens and floating schools battling other school kids and then witches. 9 is a return to fantasy as a tribute to the games that came before it. And then 10 brings us the world of Blitzball, big cities, and a world that for the first time is kind of modeled off something different compared to the other games, this time being inspired by Southeast Asia. 11 is straight up an old school MMORPG with fantasy tropes abound. 12 is a return to magic versus technology and a vast desert-filled world, echoing more Star Wars than Final Fantasy. 13, 1, 2, and 3 are straight up anime as hell and set in a semi-futuristic world. And 15...
I never played 11, 12, and 13. Sorry, my fucking nose. Give me a second, chat. Oh god, I didn't mute the microphone for that? Yum. I thought I muted the microphone. Oops!
2 and 3 are straight up anime as hell and set in a semi-futuristic world. And 15 is literally 4 dudes pushing a car to the song Stand By Me. And I saved 14 for last since it's ongoing, and honestly, since Yoshida produces this game as well, it makes sense to save this for the end of the list. If you don't know the history of this game, just go watch the No Clip documentary. It's amazing. But it also clearly establishes that 14 is a love letter to every single one of these other games I mentioned. Yoshida and the team love Final Fantasy. There is absolutely no way they would set out to ruin that. The changes they've made to 16 aren't drastic or crazy attempts to lure a new audience. They're keeping with tradition. And yeah, you may still have the complaint that it's more Game of Thrones than Final Fantasy. And first, I feel like a lot of people are still upset about Game of Thrones. Look, it hurt me too. That ending sucked. But it's still like a loaded phrase. It's akin to calling something the Dark Souls of. There's this connotation that they're not trying to do anything new. They're just trying to copy something else and lure people in. But I still feel like that complaint is off the mark. Like, I don't understand what you mean by that. I don't think you mean fantasy settings. There have been fantasy settings in Final Fantasy games forever. Is that it's trying to be more adult, more mature, have sexual situations, violence, swearing in that fantasy setting? I mean, you probably didn't play or like Final Fantasy Tactics then, because that game is Game of Thrones as shit. And it's not even a mainline game. Adult themes have been part of Final Fantasy.
And it's one of the best Final
decades.
Fantasies.
The only difference is, culturally, we're in a place where the average video game player is 30-something. And the developers, and more importantly, the translators who are responsible for making a lot of the previous Final Fantasy games more kid-friendly, they're like, oh, we don't have to hide our adult story under the veneer of teen or kid-friendly anymore. Just some examples off the top of my head. Final Fantasy VI had genocide, suicide, slavery, and much worse, but that's spoilers. 7 literally had a scene where a man tries to rape one or more of the main characters. Hell, there's straight up a story beat about forcing 2 characters into interspecies sex. One of the main themes of 9 is a child coming to terms with life, death, and what any of it's for. Hell, 10 is about the corruption of religion. There are so many examples I couldn't possibly remember all of them or spell them out for you, but I'm sure people in the comments will. And that's what rubs me wrong about all of this. None of it's new. Even the complaints. You don't even have to go far back to see examples of that. When Final Fantasy XII came out, fans thought it was a little too mature and serious compared to 10 and 10-2, which had some mature themes but were presented differently. When 7 came out, sure, it was praised by many people, but at the same time, reviewers would say stuff like, the storytelling is lengthy, involved, and definitely too dialogue heavy for preteen attention span. There's also swear words in adult situations.
What the fuck?
But while most Japanese RPGs are happy to adopt an if it's not broke, don't fix it attitude in bringing their titles across from the 16-bit days, Final Fantasy VII has decided to divorce itself almost entirely from its predecessors and tip the whole genre on its head. Look, it's more than okay.
It was a big jump.
Not like a game for any number of reasons. If you don't like 16, that's fine. But to say it's not Final Fantasy or leaving fans behind is an insult to the legacy of what these games are. They're all unique. They're all different and willing to try unique and different things. That's what makes them special. So while you may not like the changes they made to
good use
this
of the
one,
music
like
here,
how I didn't like 13, it's still exactly what it has always been. Taking chances, pushing boundaries, and trying to reach a new audience. That's what makes it such a fun franchise. You can be a fan of 8, or 12, or 4, or 6, or 16, or maybe just 7. But I promise you, for the vast majority of fans, even you watching right now, you most likely became a fan because of a risk or change that might have upset another player. But it got you hooked. There is no My Final Fantasy. There's just Final Fantasy. Good, bad, and everything in between.
Oh shit, I'm not subscribed to Jesse Cox. Yo, he's almost at 100. He's almost at 1 million. Damn. Okay, this is a really good video. Check out Jesse Cox's channel, guys. He's actually almost to 1 million subs. I agree with that take 100%. I think that Final Fantasy 16 is a new concept in a lot of ways, but for some people, for some fans, it's a little too drastic of a difference compared to what the series has been over the last few years. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Some people are looking at it as a bad thing because in general, they have this idea of what Final Fantasy should be. And as he has pointed out, when Final Fantasy VII, which is arguably the most popular and most famous Final Fantasy game of all time, first came out, there were people that were not really feeling it, that were saying that, hey, it's too different from what Final Fantasy is. They jumped a little too far outside of that box. But look what it ended up doing. It ended up catapulting the series into a higher stratosphere to basically reach tons of people that would have never touched a Final Fantasy game ever. Like my cousin in particular, right? Sonic, we played Mortal Kombat, we played Street Fighter, Lion King on Sega Genesis, which was a difficult ass game. We played all kinds of different games, but we never played any RPGs whatsoever. It wasn't until Final Fantasy VII came out and my cousin was like, it's so big, it's 3 discs. And I was like mind blown at that fact. He borrowed it from a friend, brought it over, we played it, we fell in love with it. So much to the point that when he left and we had just beaten disc 1, I told my mom, I was like, Mom, we need, because my cousin didn't live near me at the time. I was like, we need to go and get this Final Fantasy game. Didn't know it was called Final Fantasy VII. Went to the flea market, because back then we didn't have GameStops. We had the Swap Shop, which is an amazing flea market in South Florida. And we went to the video game stand, which it was this dude with a big old cowboy hat, and he had a cage with a tarp around it, and all his games were behind the cage. And he basically, you ask him what game you want, you point at it or whatever through the cage, and he reaches his hand over, grabs the money, and then hands you the game. To me, it was better than what GameStop was, to be honest. There's so many good memories. But he gave me the newest Final Fantasy at the time, which was Final Fantasy VIII, and I had no idea. Went home, booted up the game, did not look familiar at all. There was a flea market, so there's a no return policy. I was scared shitless. I did not want to tell my mom and risk getting my ass beat to the intro of Final Fantasy VIII in the background. I ended up playing it, liking Final Fantasy VIII, which was my second RPG that I ever played, and my cousin Kevin, who had Final Fantasy VII, he told me he beat it and he wanted to play 8, so we traded, and that's how I ended up playing 7 and enjoying it on my own. That essentially was the gateway for me, and I ended up being a fan of Final Fantasy. I ended up getting Final Fantasy IX after that. When I got my PS2, my first game with PS2 was Final Fantasy X. I saw it in the we went to Sears. We went to Sears back when they were an actual store. We went to Sears on the second floor, had electronics and stuff, so we ended up buying a PS2 from there, a memory card, and Final Fantasy X with it. And I'll never forget like being mind blown at how far like the series had came. And of course, we got into other RPGs because of it, like with SNES emulators. We ended up playing the Dragon Ball Z Legendary Sandan Setsu, which is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. We ended up playing Super Mario RPG, which is getting a remake, which is really cool. And other ones that would come out. I was really into RPGs because of Final Fantasy VII. There's a lot of people that I met in my life that when they heard that I played Final Fantasy VII, it was my favorite, kind of shitted on me. It was like, oh, 6 is the best one. Like, you know, you're not a real Final Fantasy fan. And I'm like, well, I guess. 6 might be good, and at the time I hadn't played it, but eventually I did end up playing it, and I ended up liking it too. But I think that's what the magical thing is about 7 is 7 is so good and appeals to so much of a variety of people because it's so different that it brought in new fans, that it made them go back and play all the other ones and find other great ones within the series, which is what I was talking about earlier, which is what every Final Fantasy after 7 has tried to aim to do by creating drastically different things and implementing new designs and implementations of like combat mechanics and graphics and music and characters and the story and whatnot to try to bring on newcomers into the series. And I think 16 will do that. Probably not as a wide scale as 7 did, of course, because that was just a phenomenon. But we got like Devil May Cry fans that are playing Final Fantasy 16 for the first time, or their first Final Fantasy for the first time. And they're talking about playing the original games now and going back and playing 7 finally. We got God of War fans that are playing Final Fantasy games now. And it's like, that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to get to these younger, newer audiences within the triple game sphere and appeal to them with 16 to get them to enjoy the series and become a fan to overall benefit the future of Final Fantasy as a whole. That's not to say turn-based won't sell really well. I mean, Persona 5 hit 10 million, but it took how many years? It took, was it 9 years, right? For the entire series of Persona 5. So we're talking about Royal, the original, and Strikers and all that stuff. The arguments will never end, you're right. Every Final Fantasy game that comes out, people will be having the same arguments, and it'll just be annoying. But I think that like the discussion is healthy to have, because at the end of the day, that's how we as people grow, is by having discussions of opposite opinions and finding a way to meet in the middle. Ultimately, I'm not the same person that I was last year or 3 years ago, right? Because I have certain opinions on things, and then I meet with people, and then I have a different outlook and a different viewpoint, and ultimately that's how you grow as a person. It's the greatest thing, in my opinion. And I think it's the personal, if you ask me, is the meaning of life. To embrace and experience all kinds of different thoughts, culture, and experiences, and ultimately use that to change yourself and grow as a person. Final Fantasy 16 is not like FF7. FF games do things different that no other game is doing, like FF7 CGI cutscenes, 12's Gambit, 8's Gunblade. Now tell me what new thing did 16 do that no other game did? They have actual good acting in it. No anime grunts, voice dialogue in general. Active time lore is a very good implementation that I think is going to change the way RPGs and story games are essentially done going forward. You can play as summons now. Okay, that's true. That's an entirely new thing. You can actually take the form of summons and control them in full crazy scale battles. Whereas before, summons until Final Fantasy X were just a cutscene, an animated cutscene. You just summon them, they do an attack, and then they disappear. Now you actually control them and like do things with them. Final Fantasy X kind of did it like Pokemon style. Clive is a grown man protagonist. You see him grow from like his teens to his 20s and now his 30s. Removing elemental advantages and disadvantages and status elements make no sense though. Come on, guys. Other than that, the game is good. I agree with that. Yeah, it's weird that I can destroy and clap bombs' cheeks with fire. I feel like when they introduced the bomb enemies, they should have had me like switch to any other icon in order to fight them. I think that would have been really cool. They definitely missed the mark on that. Everyone except Clive is invincible. Didn't 15 do that too? Like I swear, like after battles in 15, like you didn't really have to use like a Phoenix Down. Phoenix Down was like a battle, an in-battle thing, whereas after battles they kind of revive them with like low health. Initially when I played Final Fantasy 16's like demo in London, I thought that I got slowed by bad breath, but it just might have been just me panicking and trying to get out of it. My main complaint though with it is that there's no elemental bonus. I feel like that would have been really cool, is like actively switching it up to do that. But again, shout out to Jesse Cox for that video. I understand 100% what he's trying to say, and I do agree with it because I felt that way as well previously before watching the video, and then now watching it. It's kind of reassuring to see that other people do have the same take as me. I think Final Fantasy as a series has always been aiming to expand further than what it previously was with each new title. Not necessarily 16 in its sense, but like every single title has always aimed to see how much further can they push it, what elements can they change to sort of expand what Final Fantasy essentially is. And 16 does it in a more drastic way in my opinion than other games did before it, with it being fully action based, no turn-based elements outside of, I guess, cooldowns, you could say, but like cooldowns aren't necessarily a turn-based thing. It's just a cooldown. I like the direction of the combat. I think it's really fun and it's really unique for the story that they're trying to tell. But a lot of fans don't feel that way, at least not right now. And I don't think it's a case of you having to get on board with it. By all means, you don't have to like a Final Fantasy or like a game's like design by any means. You're well within your right to dislike or like whatever it is you want. I just think at the end of the day, this doesn't necessarily mean it's not a Final Fantasy game. So feel free to check out his video. I'll be linking it below. And also, while you're at it, hit that like button if you enjoyed and subscribe if you are new. More Final Fantasy videos on the way, and you do not want to miss them. My name is BltzZ, and thanks for watching.